Welcome to BeFM Drama, where we turn great works of English literature into gripping radio. I'm your host, Joshua Cornwell, and this evening we're presenting Part 4 in our 5-part adaptation of The Harpooned Man by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, a classic Sherlock Holmes mystery. Holmes has agreed to assist the promising young Inspector Hopkins with a puzzling and bloody murder, the killing by harpoon of the fearsome former sea captain Peter Carey, a rage-filled drunk who was hated by his community and family. On their return to the shack where Carey was murdered, a week after the crime, Holmes, Watson, and Hopkins saw that someone had tried to break in and set a trap for the intruder in case he returned. The plan worked, and the three men have captured the terrified young John Hopley Neligan, the son of a disgraced banker who, for some reason, has been trying to examine the murdered Peter Carey's logbooks, the records of his time at sea. In episode 4 of our program, Neligan prepares to tell his story. The terrified young man rested his body on Peter Carey's sea chest, hung his head in his hands, and took several deep breaths before finally looking up at us and beginning his tale. His father had taken most of the blame for the vast securities scam that had bankrupted so many honest citizens in the south of the country, for his partner, Dawson, had already retired at the time. Young John Neligan was only 10 years old at the time of the scandal, but was old enough to feel the shame and horror of his father's disgrace and the pain it carried for his family. He grew up being told that his father had stolen all the securities and fled, but John didn't believe it. He always felt it had been his father's intention to pay back his creditors in full, and that he would have done so if given enough time. No, John Neligan knew in his heart that something terrible must have happened to his father, because he'd never have chosen to abandon his family to such shame. Neligan Sr. had fled in his little yacht for Norway just before the warrant had been issued for his arrest. John clearly remembered the final night when his father bade farewell to his weeping mother. He left his wife and son a handwritten list of all the securities he was taking with him, and swore he would come back with his honor cleared and debts paid. No word was ever heard from him again. Both the man and his yacht vanished from the face of the earth. John and his mother believed that Neligan Sr., his yacht, and his ill-fated securities all lay together somewhere on the bottom of the ocean. Years later, months before Peter Carey's murder, a family friend had informed John Neligan that several of his father's long-lost securities had somehow reappeared in trading on the London markets. John was dumbfounded by this incomprehensible news and spent months tracing them, until at last, after many difficulties and false trails, he discovered that the original seller had been Captain Peter Carey, the former owner of the hut where we sat, lately impaled on a whaler's steel harpoon. John Neligan shook his head and sighed, resigned to his awful situation.
Naturally, I made some inquiries about Peter Carey. I learned he had been in command of a whaler that returned from the Arctic seas at the time my father was crossing to Norway. It was stormy that year. My father's yacht could have well been blown off course to the north. Could it have been met there by Peter Carey's ship? And, if so, what had become of my father? If I could learn from Peter Carey how he managed to put my father's securities on the market, I might prove that my father never sold them, and had never intended to selfishly enrich himself by taking the securities with him.
And so you came down to Sussex?
Yes, with the intention of confronting the captain, but I arrived soon after his terrible death occurred. I read in the inquest that he kept his ship logs in his cabin, and it occurred to me that if I found his log page for the month of August 1883, I might learn my father's fate. I tried to get in last night, but couldn't open the door. Tonight I tried again, and succeeded.
What did you find in the logs?
Nothing. Only that the pages from that month had been torn out. A moment later I found myself your prisoner.
Is that all?
Yes, that is all.
You have nothing else to tell us?
Neligan hesitated for a moment.
No, there's nothing.
You have not been here before last night?
No.
Then, how do you account for this?
Hopkins held up the incriminating notebook with a list of securities, which bore the initials of our prisoner on the very first page. Neligan collapsed, sinking down on his knees and trembling.
Where did you get it? I thought I had lost it at the hotel.
That is enough. Whatever else you have to say, you'll say in court.
The inspector turned to Holmes.
I'm very much obliged to you and to your friend for coming down to help me, Mr. Holmes. As it turns out, your presence was unnecessary, as I would have brought the case to conclusion without you. But, nonetheless, I'm grateful. Rooms have been reserved for you at the village hotel. We can all walk down to the village together.
The next morning, Holmes and I caught a train back to London and sat thoughtfully in our compartment.
Well, Watson, what do you think of it?
I can see that you are not satisfied.
Oh, my dear Watson, I am perfectly satisfied. But I am disappointed in Stanley Hopkins. I thought better of him. One should always look for possible alternatives in the solution of a crime and provide against inconsistencies. It is the first rule of criminal investigation.
What alternative solution do you see?
I've been working on my own line of investigation. It may give us nothing or everything. I cannot tell, but I will follow it to the end.
Several letters were waiting for Holmes at Baker Street. He snatched one of them up, opened it, and burst out into triumphant laughter.
Excellent, Watson! My alternative develops. Get a telegraph form. Good. Now let me dictate a couple of messages. First, Sumner shipping agent. Send 3 men for interviews at 10 tomorrow morning. Basil. That's my name in those parts. And now, the second. Inspector Stanley Hopkins. Come for breakfast tomorrow at 9:30. Important. Wire if unable to come. Sherlock Holmes. Good. Watson, this infernal case has haunted me for 10 days. I hereby banish it completely from my life. Tomorrow I will hear the last of it forevermore.
At 9:30 sharp the next morning, Inspector Stanley Hopkins appeared, and we sat down together for the excellent breakfast which Mrs. Hudson had prepared for us. The young inspector was in high spirits at his success.
You really think that your solution must be correct?
I could not imagine a more complete case.
It did not seem to me conclusive.
You astonish me, Mr. Holmes. What more could one ask for?
Does your explanation cover every point?
Undoubtedly. Young Neligan arrived at the village hotel on the exact day of the crime. His room was on the ground floor, and he could come and go as he liked. That very night, he went down to Woodman's Lee, saw Peter Carey in his hut, argued with him, and killed him with the harpoon.
Holmes smiled and shook his head.
Really now?
Yes. Horrified by what he had done, he fled the hut, dropping the notebook he had brought in order to question Peter Carey about the securities. You surely observed that some of them were marked with ticks, but most were not. Those with tick marks have been traced on the London market, but the others, presumably, were still in Peter Carey's possession, and young Neligan was anxious to recover them in order to do the right thing for his father's creditors. After his escape, he did not dare approach the hut again for some time, but at last he forced himself to do so in order to obtain the information he needed. Surely that is all simple and obvious.
It seems to me that your explanation has a single drawback, Hopkins.
What is it?
That it's intrinsically impossible. Have you ever tried to drive a harpoon through a body? No? Come now, my dear sir, you must pay attention to these details. My friend Watson would tell you I spent a whole morning on that exercise. It's no simple thing. It takes a strong, practiced arm. The blow was delivered with such violence that the head of the weapon struck deep into the wall. Do you imagine that this noodle-armed, anemic youth was capable of such an assault?
Hopkins' face reddened.
Is Neligan the man who bargained with the rage-filled Black Peter over rum water in the dead of night? Was his the bearded profile seen in the window 2 nights before? No, Hopkins. It is another, much more physically formidable man that we are seeking.
Hopkins' hopes and ambitions were all crumbling around him under this verbal assault, but he would not abandon his position without a fight.
You can't deny that Neligan was there the night of the murder, Mr. Holmes. The notebook proves that. I have the evidence to satisfy a jury, even if you're able to pick holes in my case. Besides, Mr. Holmes, I've laid my hand upon my man. Where is this terrible person of yours?
The bell rang at the door downstairs.
I rather think he might be on the stair. I think, Watson, that you would do well to put your gun where you can reach it.
I secured my revolver, and Holmes rose and set a piece of paper on the side table.
Now we are ready.
With that, we've come to the end of Part 4 in our 5-part adaptation of The Harpooned Man here on BeFM Drama. What trap has Holmes set in motion, and how does he intend to secure this powerful suspect in the murder of Peter Carey? Find out tomorrow evening in the thrilling conclusion of our story here on BeFM Drama.